A selector in CSS is how you associate a particular style with a particular part of the HTML or XHTML file. For example, the word body here is a selector, and this type of a selector is called a tag selector. So this will select any elements that are body elements in the document. So by HTML or XHTML rules, there can only be one body element in the HTML file, and there it is. And it starts there, and it ends down here at the end of the document. So that body selector will apply this style to the body element. So the body of the document will have this background color, it'll have this margin, and it will have this font family applied to it. Now, the C in CSS stands for cascading. They're cascading style sheets. So this font family will be applied to all of the descendant elements within the body. So if we look at this HTML file here, inside of the body we have a div, inside the div we have this H1, we have this P. So the div is descendant from the body. The H1 is descendant from div. This P is a sibling to H1 and is also descendant from div. So you have descendant elements and sibling elements that are all descended from the body. So this body style really applies to all of those things, unless they're overridden. You can also select several things in a selector. In this case, we have 3 different tags selected, separated by commas. So all the H1 tags, all the H2 tags, and all the H3 tags have this color property and this margin property. So the color property is easily recognizable. When we look at the document in the browser, we see that this is an H1 and this is an H2, and they have that color property attached to them. And that happens here because they're all selected in this compound selector that selects 3 different tags. So those are tag selectors, and that's how tag selectors work. The next kind of selector that I want to talk about are called ID selectors. And here you see an ID selector. You see this pound sign there. That means that it's an ID selector. And the ID is content. And so if we look in the HTML file, we'll see ID equals content, and it's on a div element. So I have selected any div element with an ID of content. Now, if I were to take this ID equals content and move it, let's say I move it down here to this H1. So this first header now has this ID of content. This style will not apply to an H1 element with the ID of content because I have specified that it has to be a div element. So if I go over here now and look in the browser, we'll see that that style with the border and the different color and the centering is no longer applied anywhere. If I were to change this in the CSS file to say H1 content and save that and now bring it up, you'll see that now this H1 is centered and it has the border and the different background color. That style has now been applied to H1. If I were to take this H1 out and only specify the ID selector, now any element with that ID selector will be selected, and this will still work. And in fact, I can go back here to the HTML file and I can put this ID selector back on the div where it belongs and leave this without specifying the div. Now it's just specifying any element with an ID of content, and that will now work exactly as we expect it. So normally, I actually leave it this way. When I'm doing a project in production and I have an ID selector, I will usually not specify which type of element it belongs to. And the reason for that is, according to the rules, an ID selector can only be used once. In other words, I can only have one element in my entire document that has an ID equal to content. If I say ID equals content here, that is technically not allowed. It may work in some contexts, and I'm not saying that it won't. What I'm saying is that that's not the purpose of the ID selector. An ID selector is supposed to be unique. Now, if you want to use a style over and over again on different types of elements, or even on the same type of element in more than one place within a document, that's what you would use a class selector for. So if I say here class equals blue, now I have a class selector, and I can use that same class selector in another place. I can say here class equals blue. And that is perfectly legal, and that's what class selectors are for. A class selector is for a class of style that I want to use in more than one place. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we'll go ahead and create a class in our document. We'll put it down here at the end for blue, and I'll say dot blue. And that is what a class selector looks like in CSS. A dot, like that dot right there, is for a class selector, just like this hash mark, this pound sign, is for an ID selector. So now we have this blue, and I can say color is blue. And we have a class now for blue, and as we look in the browser, we'll see that this is blue and that that is blue. And so what's happened here is we have this class of blue, and this has actually overridden the colors that were before. You'll notice over here, this says color equals 960. That's that brownish color that all of the headings were. But this heading is now blue, and that's because the class selector actually overrides the definition of just with the tag selector. So there's a hierarchy to how these things work. Class selector is near the top of that hierarchy. If I wanted to, I could even use a span and make something else blue. Class equals blue, and just apply it to one word. And now I have this word cross in the first paragraph will also be blue, and there it is in blue. Now, if I were to put a particular tag before this, like I did before with div and the ID content, now this style will only work for H1 elements that have the class of blue. And so when I reload here, now the paragraph's not blue, the span is not blue, only the H1 element is blue. So you can combine a tag selector with a class selector or an ID selector to make it apply only to a narrower type of thing. I could have this blue like this, and I could have another style that says H1.blue, and only in those cases it'll put, say, a border on it. Let's make it a darker blue so that we'll be able to see it. And so there we have that dark blue border, but all of the other ones are still blue because we have this dot blue here. But if it's an H1 element with the dot blue, it gets the border. So you see how flexible this system of selectors is. In combining the selectors, we can narrow our selection process. And so that's how class selectors and ID selectors work.